This was a study. This is actually one of the first studies of interior decoration education. And I completed this while I was on sabbatical last spring. And I got interested because I'd been looking at decorators for a long time. And the information that I was reading said you have to have training. So we have this pervasive idea that early decorators were not trained. And so I started wondering about it, and that's kind of what got me interested in this whole topic. Okay, where is the, here we are. Okay, so just a little bit about the study itself. It was a broad examination of interior decoration education. What I wanted to do was, as the first study, was just lay out principles that and ideas that people could go back and further investigate. I basically asked two questions. How and where could one obtain training, and what courses and topics made up that training? Now, I'm only going to talk about question one today because I would have to do the thing, you know, that they do on the radio. And what I'm going to do in this talk today is talk about methods of training. I'm going to identify some for you. I'm going to look at the growth of two program types. And then I also did, as part of the study, I also looked at some individual schools. I'm not going to talk about that for you today. So before I start, I want to give you some context. The period between 1880 and 1930 was one of significant change in the United States. Industrialization rapidly changed the way people lived and worked. And industrialization also created new jobs and tremendous business growth. That meant that more and different types of knowledge were needed and ways to acquire it other than the apprenticeships of the past. So that also, as part of that, education expanded in this period. Public high schools and secondary schools increased in number. The number of colleges and universities also grew, as did other types of schools like stenographer schools and industrial art schools. Higher education continued to open its doors to women, and university education was no longer limited to the wealthy or the culturally elite. Now, that does not mean that formal education was universal, however. Industrialization also created new jobs and new professions, such as stenographers, industrial designers. The progressive movement toward the end of the 19th century was a social political reform movement, and it stressed specialization of knowledge and scientific solutions to modern problems. So that gave rise to an increasing number of professions, people calling themselves professionals, and professionalization. It also gave rise to the expert, the idea of the person with specialized knowledge. And here you see an ad. On the left, you see the George Flint Company talking about their furniture, and it's well made. And then 6 months later, they're also advertising that they have experts in the history of decorative arts that will help you decorate your home. So you can see there's a switch there that's taking place. Another thing that happened in this period was that Americans began to pay more attention to art and design. And they were influenced by the English aesthetic and arts and crafts movement, and so critics began to declare that American art and taste was sadly lacking and calling for reforms. And you're probably thinking, yeah, I can see why when you look at this image. Actually, in 1880, this was very high style, and it was a reform image. Now, by 1900, the picture had totally changed. The home was a particular focus because it was thought to be the refuge from and antidote to the perceived negative effects of industrialization. The home environment was believed to affect the inhabitants positively or negatively, depending on how it was decorated and furnished. So that meant that home decoration was far too important to be left to chance, and a flood of newspapers, books, and magazines explained how to decorate correctly and tastefully. Tastefully was one of the buzzwords of the day. They also distributed information about interior decorators and advice on how to become one. And writers in these periodicals insisted that training for interior decorators was necessary, and of course that sets the stage for significant growth in interior decoration education. Now, most of us, if I ask you all what's an interior decorator, you could probably tell me. But the question that I had to address was, what did it mean between 1880 and 1930? And as you can see in this definition here from 1916, the term actually evolved. It started out referring to people who decorated walls, painters, artists, wallpaper hangers. It also kind of expanded to include antique dealers, cabinet makers, and upholsterers. And then, by the early 20th century, it came to mean someone who planned and furnished the interior. And that also meant that you had to, really, when you're looking at these topics, you had to kind of figure out, were they addressing the furnisher or were they addressing the painter? Here you see two examples. This is from one of the schools that I studied, the School of Industrial Art at the Pennsylvania Museum. The top image is from their 1905 catalog. And you see there interior decorating students actually using stencils to decorate walls. And their curriculum was very focused on wall decoration. 20 years later, in 1925, you can see in the lower image, they've moved away from that, and they're starting to address the needs of the decorator and the furnisher. And at some of the schools I studied, you definitely see that. You also see it in the literature. So now we want to look at the methods of training. They kind of fall into two categories, informal or non-institutional. This dominated early in the period because institutional training was in its infancy. And it was, throughout the period, it was very accessible for most people, particularly women. Formal education included certificates, courses, degree programs at various schools, Saturday and evening classes, lectures, and also correspondence courses. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of informal methods, and then we'll look at institutions. In 1895, Candace Wheeler, who was a decorator, wrote an article called Interior Decoration as a Profession for Women. And she lamented that there was a lack of holistic training in interior decoration as there was in architecture. And she recommended putting together an individual course of study. Now, she didn't specifically say what it needed to be, but the other publications did. The earliest recommendation that I found that had decorator training, putting forth an idea of decorator training, was in 1885. It was a newspaper article in Boston Daily Globe. And she said that you should read, and you should read the masters, one of whom was William Morris. So reading became kind of a really important part of that individual study. Initially, you could learn interior decoration that way. Some people insisted that it was training should come partly from books, or later on, it was a supplement to formal education or what other type of study that you did. The second most common recommendation was to visit the best houses, museums, hotels, stores, and also manufacturers and artisans. And in doing that, you would, quote, develop the faculty of observation and critical judgment, end quote, and you could also learn how things were made. And schools will later do these two things. They'll bring people in, they'll go do field trips. Last but not least were lectures and study. Various clubs and art societies and people put on study of interior decoration. Example, the Sketching Club in Indianapolis studied interior decoration at its meetings in 1905. I don't think that was necessarily professionally directed. The Metropolitan hosted a whole session of interior decoration throughout the period of study. Whether it was addressing professionals, I don't know. The oldest means of learning a craft or a trade or even a profession was the apprenticeship. And until the second half of the 19th century, apprenticeships were the main path into building, design, construction, and related trades, including painters, wallpaper hangers, and cabinet makers. And apprenticeships were a common and sometimes the only means for interior decorators until well into the 20th century. Now, the apprenticeship served a lot of purposes. Literature illustrated a lot of this. It was the cornerstone of self-education. And some actually advocated it as the best way to learn interior decoration over formal training. Some people said you could supplement formal training with practical training, and you could actually apply the theory that you had learned in school, you could apply it in practice. It was also a way to learn the business because a lot of schools didn't teach business in this period. And later on, some schools will encourage their students to work with practitioners. Now, as far as the formal education goes, this is not mentioned very much in period literature, but the earliest collegiate instruction in home decoration occurred in schools of household arts, domestic science, and later home economics. And the first places where this was taught was at Midwestern land-grant institutions. These were established after the passage of the first Morrill Act in 1862. And soon after these new state colleges admitted women, they began to offer courses to prepare them for their careers as wives, mothers, and homemakers. And there you see the three earliest, Iowa, Kansas, and Illinois industrial. Iowa State and Kansas State still offer interior design today. And it's important to remember that these programs were not directed toward the professional. They were directed toward the professional housewife. And a lot of these programs actually believed that the housewife should be as well educated as her husband, and they taught things like physics and French and botany and chemistry and various other topics. So they were not aimed at professional decorators. Study of art was one of the most frequent recommendations for interior decorators, and it was probably the most accessible means for most people, particularly women. And starting in the second half of the 19th century, education in art for everyone, particularly drawing, was being touted as necessary for an industrializing nation. Not only would it improve taste, which we know was sadly lacking, but it was, quote, an essential skill and moral force. And more important, quote, it could stimulate the rational powers of the mind, end quote. And so this heralded the beginning of art education on a larger scale. And as you see here, drawing and principles of art were taught in public schools. They were also taught at new art and design schools and also schools of industrial art. Study in the visual arts was also part of the liberal arts at various universities. Now, not only did study of art develop the mind and the eye, but the principles of art were also believed to be the same in all media. Once you learn them, they were applicable to almost any field, including decoration and architecture. And I do know that some of the early female architects who were not allowed to go to architecture school actually entered through learning art. And last, we have correspondence courses. These were pretty prominent in the early 20th century. The first significant use of these occurred in the 1780s, and by about 1900, they were being taken up by commercial interest. The first one that I know of related to the home was the 1907 American School of Home Economics. They published the Library of Home Economics, and it was actually a home study course for homemakers and teachers. And the first volume was Isabelle Bavier's 1904 book, The House, Its Plan, Decoration, and Care. She was a home economist at the University of Illinois. One of the earliest that focused on interior decoration was the home study course in decorative arts by Cheryl Whitten in 1915. Others soon followed. They were widely advertised, no way to know how many people took them. And some schools actually offered residential study. You could go to the school and study interior decoration, or they had home study courses. One of the earliest to do that was the New York School of Interior Decoration, which was founded by Cheryl Whitten in 1916. And they still exist today, except they're now the New York School of Interior Design. I don't think they offer home study courses, and I don't know whether they offer online courses. So we'll take a look at the growth of training. I looked at that in two different types of programs. I looked at it in art, and I looked at it in home economics. And to look at the art, I used the American Art Annual. This was a periodical that was published between 1899 and 1940. And it answered a need for a periodical that addressed the progress of art in the United States. And they had such varied information as obituaries of artists, what's in the galleries, and what was important for me is they had a comprehensive list of schools. And they solicited their information via letter. Down at the bottom, you see the 6 years that I looked at. I was really trying to go every 5 years, and when I hit 19, 20, 25, and 30, they just weren't available. So I had to settle for 1917 and 1926. And what you see here is a summary of what I found from 1899, 1915, 1917, and 1926. I did not include the reports for 1905 and 1910 because they listed departments and that limited the numbers. They are color-coded by the type of school, and you can see there's universities, there's normal schools, art schools, design schools, industrial art schools, and mechanics institutes. I coded them by name, by what the name of the school was. If it said industrial art, it was industrial art. If it said design, it was included there. Mechanics institutes were established in the 1820s as a means to provide technical training for working males, and they were actually a common means to learn architectural drawing and design in the 19th century. And summer schools with interior decoration were offered by independent organizations such as the Commonwealth Art Colony, Massachusetts, or some art schools such as the New York School of Fine and Applied Arts, which is now Parsons' new school of design, and they do offer interior design. Undoubtedly, some schools were missing. One of the schools I studied in depth was the School of Industrial Art at the Pennsylvania Museum. They started offering interior decoration courses in 1895, but it doesn't really make an appearance until 1905. So what do we see here? Well, we see that, and I realized I left off the date at the top. The top one is 1899. There are 4 schools out of 63 among 32 cities in 19 states. They were the University of California in Berkeley, the University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture, the Ash School of Art in Memphis, and the New York School of Applied Design for Women. None of these schools teach interior design today. But what do we see when we look here? We see that the number of schools addressing interior decoration, teaching interior decoration, increased significantly from 4 in 1899 to 121 in 1921. Increasing were the types of schools. In 1899, there were only 3. By 1915, there were 6. And all of the numbers, all of them rose every year, but universities and art schools had the highest numbers. You can look and see in 1899, there were only 2 universities teaching interior decoration, and by 1926, there were 49. In 1899, there was only 1 art school teaching interior decoration, and by 1926 there were 45. By the way, normal schools are teachers' colleges, in case you didn't know that. And the cities, the number of cities and states where interior decoration was taught increased too and became more widespread. In 1899, 4 out of 32 cities. In 1926, 87 out of 230. In 1899, 4 out of 19 states. Now those are 19 states that are reporting, not 19 states in the Union, okay. And 34 out of 45, including the District of Columbia. And you're probably looking at 1915, where interior decoration is only 0.9% of 296 schools. That particular year, for some reason, most schools did not report exactly the topics that they were teaching. They just said they were teaching art, and that's why that anomaly occurred in that situation. Previously, schools were located in larger cities like Chicago or New York, and New York was consistently had the highest number of interior decoration schools throughout the entire period. But by 1926, Indianapolis, Portland, Maine, Detroit, Kansas City, Troy, New York, Norman, Oklahoma, Nashville, and Logan, Utah boasted training for interior decorators. I also looked at home economics, and that was a little harder to do because home economics schools did increase during the period. You can trace that, but a lot of times they don't tell you exactly what they were teaching. However, so there's no American Art Annual for home economics. But I did find a study by Benjamin R. Andrews entitled Education for the Home that he did in 1914 and 15 that surveyed 450 colleges and universities that admitted women about courses related to the home, and he took a broad view of the home. He included the traditional cooking, laundry, sewing, along with things like the economic position of women. He found that out of the 450, 257 schools had distinctive home economics courses, 43 offered applied science courses related to the home, which he said meant that, quote, 2/3 of the colleges are already recognizing this field, end quote. Now he also had, and for me, 87 schools reported on what they taught. And out of them, 68 or 78% offered a course on, or coursework on the home. Compare that, if you will, to 73 or 84% that offered courses in foods and nutrition and textiles and clothing. So house decoration was not the top of the food chain, if you will. These courses right here were the types of courses, and they're offered in descending order. For example, house sanitation, there were 35 schools that taught that. There were 30 in house structure and design, 24 in house decoration, 20 in house furnishings and household equipment. So why did that occur? Well, two scholars looked at the relationship, the instruction of art and design in home economics, and they noted that early coursework was concerned with aesthetics, consumer education, and factors that would lessen housework and make the home more attractive and comfortable and hygienic for the inhabitants. Again, they're still trying to create that professional housewife. The focus on professional careers in art and design came slowly. I did see a little bit of a change in the 1920s when home economics programs began to expand their offerings into art and related art and design. And they would also mention in their catalogs the positions that were open to women with degrees in home economics, and interior decoration was one of them. Home economics has not been a really strong player traditionally in interior decoration until probably about 1950 or so. So why the growth? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to tell you. There were a lot of factors that contributed to growth in interior decoration training. The period itself was one of a sustained economic prosperity. People had more money to spend, so there was a consumer culture. There was a building boom, particularly after World War I. There were more goods. Industrialization created more goods, and people did need to know how to decorate, and so there was a greater need for the decorator. There was also a great deal of publicity about interior decoration, and the new professional interior decorator, more people could afford. A small part of this was vocational education. This occurs in the early 20th century in secondary and high schools, and some interior decoration schools, you see them courses being offered in normal schools and also in courses labeled normal arts at other types of schools. There was also the significant increase at the university level in fine arts, partly because of the art education emphasis. Also, public interest increases in this period. There's increased government support, and there's an increase in the number of not only colleges and universities, but also in enrollments. For example, between 1870 and 1900, college enrollment grew by 278%, and a lot of that was women. And that growth continued to accelerate in the early 20th century. Universities also changed their focus. They moved away from this general kind of classical education toward more specialized program in response to the demand for experts, and that attracted more students. They also started offering more programs of importance to women, because women made up a huge portion of that increase in university attendance. And this was important for decoration because decoration was being promoted as a profession for women. And the author of Women as Professional Workers noted in 1921, quote, "It seems that as half the women of our acquaintance were becoming interior decorators," end quote. So in conclusion, and what I'm going to do after I finish my conclusion, you may be wondering, okay, who's on first? Who started these? Who had the first degrees? And so I'm going to show you that. The earliest training methods consisted of self-education and apprenticeships. By the end of the 19th century, they were joined by institutional education, which experienced significant growth in the early 20th century. And by the 1920s, interior decoration was taught at slightly over 1/3 of all schools teaching it. The largest growth occurred in art schools and universities within the art or architecture context. The earliest courses at universities in house decoration were at Midwestern land-grant institutions, but these programs addressed the professional housewife, not the professional decorator. The years between 1880 and 1930 also marked the growth and development of interior decoration as a profession, and so there was an increase in the need for and demand for training. This, along with the rise of the expert, the growth of art and higher education, and other factors, contributed to the development of a range of informal and formal training methods for interior decoration. This inception and significant growth in training, particularly in higher education, indicate that interior decoration had achieved enough recognition, if not importance, for its educational needs to be addressed in diverse ways. So here's the who's on first. The earliest program that I found was the Women's Institute of Technical Design in 1885. It didn't last very long. I only found one instance of it. 1888, the Met is offering a lecture in interior decoration. The earliest school program I found was at the University of Pennsylvania in the School of Architecture. They had a 2-year program in interior decoration. They gave a certificate. They expanded it later to 3 years. For a brief period, they called it interior architecture, and in 1905, it disappeared. 1895, the School of Industrial Art at the Pennsylvania Museum started interior decoration. It was 2 years, and then by 1930, it was 4 years, and they still offered a certificate. The first degree was at Teachers College in Columbia. It was a 4-year program in house decoration. You got a BS in education. In 1912, Teachers College opened the School of Practical Art to separate education from other topics. And the 4-year program did continue, but you got a BS in house design and decoration. 1918, and what I'm showing you here are the schools that I studied as well. 1918, the University of Minnesota had a 4-year program with 2 years in the arts and sciences and 2 years in architecture, a BS in interior decoration. In 1926, the University of Oregon had a 5-year program in the School of Architecture, and you got a Bachelor of Architecture in Interior Design. Now, please understand these are not the only schools that are teaching interior design. Thank you. I don't know if I have time for questions. It's right at 10:30. If you have a burning question about this, I can maybe try to answer it, or you can see me after.
So you don't call it interior decoration anymore?
No, we don't. There's actually, I have to tell you, there's actually some uses of interior design in this period. It becomes pretty general around 1940, 1950 is when it shifts over. Let me check that. Anything else? Thank you.